Hey everyone, it's been 1 year since I made my video about switching to Linux, and I wanted to update you all on what's been happening to my setup surrounding it, since there have been so many changes happening in just 1 year. So let's get into it. If you've watched my last video about switching to Linux, you'll remember that I stated the first distro I chose to use was Debian 12, and I chose it because I believed that Debian would entail a stable experience with perhaps some older packages, which was not a problem for me. When I started out with Debian, I had mainly been using the GNOME desktop environment, and it was very suitable for my needs. I used Forge to get a neat auto-tiling setup going, and everything was working very nicely for me. But one major thing still remained an issue for me. In the switching to Linux video, one thing I mentioned was the fact that I could not get DaVinci Resolve to install or work, so that led to me making the video in Kdenlive instead. Interestingly enough, because I had mentioned that, someone made a video directing me on how to install Resolve properly by using its .run script. Unfortunately, since YouTube notifications never notified me, I didn't see the video until 4 months later while checking my mentions. I did manage to solve the problem by using Make Resolve Deb, but I still want to shout out Brown Coat in a Box for taking the time to make that video, as it did teach me a fair bit about Linux after the fact. So it looked like my video editing troubles were solved since I had Resolve and could make any video I wanted just like on Windows or macOS. However, the major caveat of using the free version of Resolve on Linux is that it lacks support for many of the common video codecs for footage. By default, you can't import recordings from OBS, downloaded videos from YTDLP, or literally almost anything. You have to convert it to proper codecs, whether that be through Handbrake or FFmpeg, and that wouldn't be a problem if those didn't take time, especially if you need to convert B-roll footage that's a few hours in length, which in that case you'll only end up using a fraction of. It's very strange that these are the circumstances for Resolve on Linux, especially since there are free and open source video editors like Kdenlive that import on my footage without any trouble relating to codecs. However, Kdenlive struggles to even play back 1080p 60fps footage in real time unless I use a proxy resolution, which neither Adobe Premiere Pro nor Resolve ever needed in my time using them, so yeah, kinda fucked. Anyways, during that time, even though GNOME was very suitable for all my needs, I considered trying out the KDE desktop environment to see what it was like, especially since it was more similar to Windows, which I had a lot of familiarity with. And while using it for the first time, it seemed to live up to all my expectations, being a little lighter and more familiar to what I was used to. However, it eventually started showing its cracks with noticeable screen tearing, crashing, and lag. This caused me to shortly after switch back to GNOME, where everything was working as expected again. Again though, I eventually wanted to try switching desktop environments again, and I wanted to try out XFCE this time. While it did entail requiring a little more manual configuration, the payoff would be huge because XFCE was a very light and fast desktop environment, and when I eventually switched over to XFCE, that was the case, and it was really great using such a fast desktop environment. But eventually XFCE also started to show its cracks as well, through screen tearing due to issues in compositing, and since it was not as recent with X11 as other desktop environments. And speaking of X11, I also got interested in trying out Wayland, because it wasn't available for me to use when I initially installed Debian, and for good reason too. And there weren't really any direct guides on how to enable or try Wayland if you're on Debian, so one of my friends, Shamey, ended up helping me try out Wayland on Debian. And it didn't really work, so I decided to just stick to X11. Going back to XFCE, I mentioned that it wasn't working the best for me on Debian, so after doing some research and discussing distros with my friend Jeff Tastic, who was also using Debian 12 at the time, we decided to try out MX Linux. While it still was Debian based, it was more optimized around XFCE and had a lot of nice tweaks and tools that would better the experience. So after hearing that it was working well for Jeff, I decided to try it out, and you could see me here using it in my first Pompous devlog. It was really nice using MX Linux, but it eventually got to the point where despite being Debian based, I couldn't find certain dependencies and essential tools like GPU screen recorder were not working. I also wanted to edit on Kdenlive, but it kept crashing so much for some reason, and I had to edit that video on macOS. And as for Jeff, it eventually got to a similar point for him as well, and he decided to switch to Fedora as a result. This is important to mention because it's what made me want to switch to Nobara after using MX Linux for about a week or two. Nobara is a Fedora-based distribution with some tweaks for gaming and general usage to solve some of the discrepancies that Fedora has by default. Nobara also uses KDE by default, but also offers the option to use GNOME as well. I decided to use KDE because I hadn't used it for some time and wanted to see if maybe it worked better on a more stable and recent base, and for a month or two, it worked great. There were some strange things like how Nobara used Wayland by default and almost shat itself trying to do anything but install the distro, and how instead of having Firefox as the default browser you would have Chromium instead, though I can understand that more as the speed of Chromium is faster than that of popular FOSS favorites like Firefox. Still gonna stick with WebKit and Gecko as long as I can though. Anyways, for the time I was using Nobara, it was pretty good. There might have been a couple hiccups here and there, but for the most part Nobara was great and served for everything I needed it to. Until it didn't. Eventually the KDE Plasma 6 update started to roll around, and I was pretty excited for it because it would add a ton of new and useful features to KDE. But keep in mind that at the time I was using Nobara, Plasma 6 had not rolled out to Fedora-based distributions. So when I updated my Nobara install one day, seeing a bunch of dependencies related to Plasma 6, I was surprised because I didn't think it would come that soon. Well, not everything is that good in life, so as a result, my install broke. Luckily, I had a timeshift backup to revert to a stable state, but since one time I was trying to play Vintage Story with Jeff, and he saw how fucked up Nobara was, he told me to install normal Fedora, which is what he was using. So I did it and it worked out, but what's the takeaway? Are these distros that fork off of bases bad? Not necessarily. While the decisions of the Nobara maintainer are questionable in the sense that Plasma 6 was adopted too early and broke my and other people's installs as a result, I think it's best to research and see if certain distros are maintained well enough to rely on them for being something so important. Anyways, I switched over to Fedora and decided to use the GNOME desktop environment again after avoiding it for so long. And surprisingly, it was the most stable Linux desktop experience I've had in a long time. It even fixed an issue I had before for such a long time using Linux, which was that Godot had delay in the editor, probably due to compositor problems. It was just so reinvigorating using something so stable, clean, and uniform that just worked. It reminded me why I love Linux and why I switched to it in the first place. Life was good with Fedora until I had to use macOS for about a month, and after a month of macOS returning to Fedora, a big update had happened for NVIDIA users on Linux. Wayland was apparently better than ever on NVIDIA as the new 555 drivers had fixed a bunch of issues that affected stability. However, these drivers hadn't rolled out to NVIDIA users on Fedora, so I decided to switch over to Linux Mint, an Ubuntu-based distribution. My thought process was that even though Ubuntu is technically Debian-based, they may have some of their own custom packages, and rolled out the 555 driver before Fedora. And since I wanted to try out Linux Mint for a while, it would be a good excuse to go ahead and try it out. So I switched over to Linux Mint and tried to install the 555 driver. However, it wasn't available yet for Mint, so I tried to install the driver by using NVIDIA's official .run script, which is a little convoluted but would get the job done. I tried twice to install the new driver through the .run script, but it ended up leaving me with no graphics, so no dice. I then tried again on Fedora 40 KDE, also no dice. It was at that point that my friend Jeff suggested that I should try installing Arc, so I did. I had actually been interested in Arc for some time before, thinking that later down the road I'll eventually have to try it. So I went ahead and went through the basic Arc installation process, and for the most part I understood mostly everything and learned a lot about how Linux works along the way. However, when it came to booting my basic Arc install after setting up Grub and mounting all my partitions, I got stuck. I couldn't get past the UEFI firmware settings on the Grub boot menu, and when I installed Arc, it was practically midnight, so I decided to give up on installing Arc manually, and figured that since I had figured out how it generally worked, I can just use an Arc-based distro and have everything set up for me conveniently. I could follow tutorials to set up Arc manually and properly, but to be honest, it was more efficient to just use an Arc-based distribution anyways. So I decided to use EndeavourOS, an Arc-based distribution that uses KDE by default. I went ahead and set it up, reinstalled the NVIDIA driver through Pacman once, and it worked as expected with all the benefits of the new driver on Wayland. On top of that, I now had access to Pacman, a super fast package manager, and the AUR, which had lots of useful packages that you can't find normally. However, after a couple of updates, Wayland did get borked with the Plasma shell, and I'm currently using X11 in the meantime. But it's not that big of a problem because I'm much more comfortable with using Wayland than before, and I'm excited to see it become even more stable and supported as time goes on. And that's where I stand today, going from Debian and GNOME 1 year ago to now using EndeavourOS with KDE. Some things that I want to mention are that during my time using Linux, I did use Ableton Live to make music through using Bottles and Wine, and while it was successful, the setup is not ideal in terms of latency. I could work to make it better, but for convenience, I made a Windows installation solely dedicated to making music for a while. For similar reasons, I also used Windows and macOS to edit some videos using Resolve temporarily because it was more convenient codec-wise. Also, one thing to mention about that Windows installation as well is that when installing new distributions, my boot files would get corrupted on the Windows side, despite the fact that my Windows installation resided on a different drive. I have no idea what could have caused it, maybe the fact that I was using CSM instead of UEFI on accident, and that didn't play well with newer versions of Windows 10, but regardless, I ended up switching over to macOS for music production. I may use Linux again in the future with Bidwig Studio and Yawbridge, but in the meantime, I'm pretty happy with my setup, even though it isn't 100% Linux supported. So yeah, that's my experience with Linux after 1 year. Let me know if you want to see another video about my Linux experience next year, and stay tuned for more videos.